Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you the second part of my review series on the Fujinon 18-55mm f2.8-4. This is an LMOIS lens. And so if you missed my first part of this episode, in that episode I took a look at the build and the design of this particular lens, some of the basic feature sets, some comparisons to the 16-55mm f2.8 Fuji lens. And also as a part of that, we took a look at the autofocus performance, and we took a look at the optical image stabilization in the lens and how it made a difference when it came to both stills and then also for video work. Now obviously that's an area where Fuji has differentiated between their two standard zoom options for their APS-C X-mount mirrorless systems. And so while the f2.8 version, it has the benefit of a larger maximum aperture, it makes it maybe the more desirable lens for portrait work, obviously for low light or event work. Whereas this shares an f2.8 aperture at the 18mm mark, but all the way by the time you get into the very early 20mm, you're already starting to close the aperture down to where you will arrive somewhere between 35 and 50mm, you'll arrive at f4. And so in that case, you're a full stop behind what the f2.8 lens. The f2.8 lens, as befits maybe more of a professional grade zoom, it has a little bit more robust build, including weather sealing, that is lacking here. Both of them, however, have linear motors. Both of them do have very nice build. And where this lens might be more attractive for some shooters is the fact that it does have that optical image stabilization. Now, Fuji claims a 5-stop image stabilization, which obviously is very effective and is on the upside of the scale of stability. And I have found for stills work that it does a great job. However, in that first episode, we took a look at some, video footage, and I determined, at least from my own work, that it's still no substitute for using motorized gimbal in terms of getting smooth footage that doesn't look like it was handheld. And so just, have realistic expectations about how much that optical image stabilization is going to do. But of course, the other area where this lens really differentiates itself from the other 16-55mm is that it really is compact. Now I elected to review the larger 16-55mm on the XT3 body, which is a better fit. It's a little bit more robust, particularly with a grip extender like I use on the XT3. In this case, I elected to review it on the new XT30, which represents Fuji's, less expensive but also more compact line. And so I think that it's obviously a much better fit on a small body like this. It's less than half the weight. At 310 grams, less than half the weight of the 16-55mm. It's about an inch shorter, it's narrower around. It takes a 58mm front filter thread as opposed to a 77mm filter thread. It's definitely a compact option. However, it does have advantages over your typical kit zoom for a number of reasons. Number one, it has a faster maximum aperture. I've got the Canon. This is for their EFM system. So this is their 18-55mm. It also has image stabilization. But the aperture range on this starts with a smaller maximum aperture, f3.5, and so that's 2/3 of a stop slower. It ends at f5.6, which is a full stop slower than what this Fuji does. So the Fuji definitely gives you some advantages when it comes to build, autofocus performance, and then also, of course, of the maximum aperture. But today I'd also like to take a closer look at how it performs optically. A lot of people say this is, like the best kit lens out there, in the comparative field. And in many ways, I think that it is. However, let's take a look at the image quality and see if it's also exceptional when it comes to that. What you're seeing here is a RAW file. However, unless you specifically turn off corrections within camera, your RAW files arrive with embedded correction already having taken place. And so obviously you can pretty well guess that an 18mm f2.8 focal length and a zoom range or a zoom lens is going to have a fair amount of vignette. We can see that vignette arrives perfectly corrected. And, at least in this setting, this is base ISO, I don't see, any kind of artifacts from doing that. What we can also see is that whatever correction has taken place in camera, there's definitely still some remaining barrel distortion that is left behind. And so, you might want to do a little bit further correction if, deemed necessary. There's not what I don't really necessarily see a mustache pattern, but neither do I see a perfectly even linear distortion pattern either. So it might take a little bit of work. So I mean, obviously this is not going to be a top pick for architecture. Now, as far as, basic resolution at f2.8, we have, fairly decent resolution in the center of the frame. I mean, I find that very usable. I don't find contrast, at least in this setting, particularly high. And so when I say contrast, I'm really referring more to what I refer to as micro contrast, to where there's a really, really obvious delineation between light and dark areas. And so, I mean, obviously one wouldn't really expect this to compete with better prime lenses. Now, if we take a look at corner performance, corners, again, are not bad. They're not exceptional. But I mean, there is resolution across the frame. Looking mid-frame here actually looks pretty good. Looking on the other side, I see a fairly similar performance, and so centering seems to be good, maybe even a hair better on the right side than what we saw on the left side. Now, to look at how this translates into a real-world shot here, we can see this is handheld, by the way, but without too much issue. We can see that it's about what we see in our test there, and that resolution is good, though not exceptional. We can see that the micro contrast is really not spectacular in some of these. And so what you're seeing as a result of that is just some of these textures they're what I would call slightly muddy. They're not really amazingly delineated, and that's the downside of that. But what we can see in this real world application is that there is a fairly even performance, and so corners actually look pretty decent. In some ways, corners I think look a hair better than what they did on the brick wall test, because there's obviously, with all of that barrel distortion, the plane of focus is not exactly flat. And so at a landscape distance, you actually get a little bit better result because, you're not dealing with as much field curvature in this kind of scene. Now, if we can compare to f2.8 to f4, still at 18 millimeters, we find that there is a little bit more contrast that's here. Resolution is not all that different looking in the center of the frame. We can see a little uptick in contrast. Looking down here, I also don't see any kind of major difference. Looking towards a corner, there's really, obviously, there's not a huge difference between the two. And so I don't see a major difference achieved by the one stop down, just maybe a little bit more contrast. Now, from f4 to f5.6, I do see some noticeably improved contrast taking place there, giving us a little bit better overall punch to the image. Corners here don't really necessarily look any better, which is kind of interesting. Stopping down, there's not been any kind of obvious improvement that's taking place there. And, in the corners, I wouldn't say contrast is picking up a lot either. And this kind of bears out what I saw in real world shooting, that there is kind of practical limitations to how sharp the lens can get, even at landscape apertures. Now, the next marked place on the zoom range dial is around 22 millimeters or 23 millimeters. And so what we see here is that our distortion pattern is significantly reduced, and not surprising with a zoom lens. Maximum aperture is f3.2, so now we're not a full stop here, we're 2/3 of a stop. Contrast between f3.2 and f4. Looking at the center of the frame on the left, f3.2, we see that there is a little bit more contrast in the center of the frame. And again, not really a whole lot different stop down to f4, at least as far as the center performance goes. In the left corner, we see that, once again, corners are okay and not spectacular. We can see there's a mild improvement at f4, but not all that significant. Same is true here. Might be a slight uptick of contrast, but not anything I don't think you would notice without them side by side. From f4 to f5.6, we see a little bit of an improvement in contrast in the center of the frame. Not a whole lot different looking resolution-wise. Once again, we see in the corners not really a big difference between f4 and f5.6. Again, if anything, it almost seems like the corners are a little bit softer when you're stopped down a little bit. So in some ways, this lens seems to be optimized to deliver some of its best performance at wider rather than narrower apertures. which is somewhat interesting. You can definitely see that f4 looks better than f5.6 in the corner at 22 millimeter. Stopping down to f8 here gives us a little more center punch. You know, it's not huge, but I do see a difference in terms of the basic contrast. And here we see that f8 corners look significantly better. And so I don't know if f5.6 was a bit of an aberration there in terms of the test for some reason, but we definitely do see a better result here at f8 than we did at f5.6. Now at 35 millimeters, maximum aperture has closed to f3.6, so we've now lost 2/3 of a stop going through the zoom range. We can see in the center of the frame here that there is a fairly noticeable improvement between f3.6 and f4, even though that's only 1/3 stop. You can definitely see better contrast and sharpness in some of those areas when it comes to the center of the frame. Moving off to the corners, in some ways this corner performance is a more even one than what we've seen so far. And again, there's a mild improvement at f4. And I think if I were owning this lens and shooting it, I would, definitely go right to f4 and skip over that, 1/3 stop of light advantage. I think the resolution trade-off is well worth it. From f4 to f5.6, not a big difference in the center of the frame, perhaps a hair more contrast, but nothing overly noticeable. Off on the upper right corner, again, about equal performance, no real improvement. Bottom right, I do see a little bit of a better improvement there, and bottom left, it may extend a fraction more sharpness into the corner, but it's not a significant difference. f5.6 to f8, I do see a little bit, just a fraction more of contrast in the center of the frame. And taking a look over at the corner, again, kind of a similar pattern there to where we're seeing a little bit of improvement of both contrast and resolution. So I would say landscape aperture over a lot of this zoom range is probably f8 is the desired one. So when we arrive at the telephoto end at 55 millimeters, maximum aperture is now f4. So there is a one-stop loss of maximum aperture between the wide end and the telephoto end, from f2.8 to f4. That being said, most kit zooms that cover 18 to 55 millimeters move from around f3.5 to f5.6. So essentially, this kit lens does have an aperture advantage pretty much across the whole range. And so f4 is one stop better than f5.6. So comparing f4 and f5.6, we see that there's only a very minor difference. Center sharpness is pretty good from wide open here and just improves only a fraction at f5.6. Off in the corner, in some ways, I think that the f4 example looks better than the f5.6 example in the corner. That may not always be true, but in this case, it certainly is. Again, I don't, in no area of the frame am I really seeing much of an improvement going to f5.6. Going from f5.6 to f8, we see that a mild improvement in contrast in the center of the frame. Resolution is fairly similar. Looking in the corners, however, I'm not really seeing much of an improvement here. And so in many ways, good news is that you're getting pretty close to peak performance at f4 at 55 millimeters. Bad news is that there's not really a whole lot more in the tank when you stop it down. Now, if we look at the bokeh quality here, I don't know what your expectations are, but this is kind of zoom lens quality here. We can see the bokeh circles are pretty busy with a very strongly defined outer edge that has a little bit of a bluish green fringing around it that makes it even more obvious. And so definitely some of that kind of onion bokeh look. This is not what I would call an exceptional result here by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, it gives you an idea. You can see that there is some deformation, geometric deformation of bokeh circles. That's actually not really too bad though. It's still fairly circular along the edge of the frame, but the actual quality of the blur is not really all that great. Here's another example that show, you're trying to maximize bokeh quality, but it's not really exceptional. Again, everything is really kind of clearly defined, a fair amount of hard edges. And so this is not it's not what I would call a bokeh beast here by any stretch of the imagination. Zooming in on our subject, it looks okay, not exceptionally sharp. And so, I mean, this is not going to make anybody think that you're using a fine prime lens for sure in this kind of shot. Now, good news is that it's not a bad lens to use when it comes to shooting the night sky. It's fairly sharp, even at f2.8 at 18 millimeters. At no point are the star points perfectly circular, as you can see. They tend to be a little bit elongated everywhere, but it doesn't get terribly worse along the edges of the frame. The elongation just kind of stretches a little bit further. But at the same time, I think if I step back and I look at the image globally, it doesn't look too bad, enough so that if you had this lens, you might as well use it for this purpose if you don't have something better to use. So this represents minimum focus, maximum magnification. As you can see, it's not particularly high here at 55 millimeters. What we can see is that there's not a huge amount of contrast at minimum focus distance. Resolution is okay, though not exceptional. Likewise, flare resistance is only so-so. We can see here that at a fairly wide. Likewise, flare resistance is only so-so. We can see in this image that we have a fair amount of veiling loss of contrast where the sun is coming through. Not a whole lot here in terms of ghosting artifacts. You can see them there. But if we look on the right side with the lens stopped down more, you can see that the ghosting pattern becomes much more defined. And also, like our sunburst effect is, it's mediocre at best. And so, across the image, I do think that contrast has held up a little bit better here at a narrower aperture, but your trade-off is that you're getting more ghosting artifacts in the deal. And there's no questioning the fact that this is a useful focal range. This shows 18 millimeter, this shows 55 millimeters. And we can see in both of these shots that, as we kind of saw in our test, what I see is that colors look good. I'm happy with that. Global contrast is okay. Micro contrast in terms of really defining leaves and the fine textures is not exceptional. I don't see them crisply delineated as I do with better quality lenses, but at the same time it is producing a very credible image. A few more here to just illustrate final points. We see once again, colors are really nice. That's a strength to me. What I observed about fine details, I consider that to continue to be true as far as these type images. The image looks good, taken globally. Not so fantastic at the fine level. So what we see is actually a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, there's a number of things that this lens does well. I think that it has a really good color rendition. I think obviously it does have very useful sharpness at maximum aperture across its range, although that sharpness is better in the center of the frame than what it is in the corners. At the same time, however, as someone who is familiar with lots of lenses, including now, at least a small selection of Fuji lenses, the absolute rendering from this lens rates at the bottom of the list for me in the lenses that I have reviewed thus far. And for the simple reason that I don't think that the images that come out of this lens have a particular depth to them. They're fairly flat. Some of the textures get a little bit smeary, as we saw in that, and so it doesn't really delineate fine details. So thus the micro contrast, the global contrast is good, but the micro contrast when it comes to delineating fine details and holding up resolution, even right down towards a pixel level, it's not quite there. And in that case, if I were just choosing a lens for the optical performance between the two, I definitely prefer the 16 to 55 millimeter. It also has a few flaws and it's not as sharp in the extreme corners as what I like, but it definitely shows better micro contrast and rendering of the fine details. And so it would be my preference when it comes to that. It's certainly my preferential lens when it comes to shooting portraits or anything where you want a more shallow depth of field. And it certainly has a distinct advantage when it comes to that. So at the end of the day, I think this really comes down to a matter of what your priorities are. Obviously, neither one of these lenses are cheap relative to competing lenses on other systems. This lens comes in right now, the retail price in the US at B&H Photo is $599. That compares to, at the moment, $1,099 for the 16 to 55. So you're definitely moving into premium territory with the 16 to 55. Even with this lens, you're more expensive than most kit lenses, but you're also getting a better lens than most kit lenses. At the same time, those that say that this lens is the equivalent of the 16 to 55, I'm going to have to beg to differ. Certainly not in an absolute optical sense. You know, maybe for those that have looked at resolution charts, if you're just looking at the base resolution, it may not be all that different. But when it comes to real-world images, this lens produces flatter, less micro contrasty images that just don't render fine details quite as well, and leave me with images that I like fine on a global level, but if I zoom into a pixel level, I'm just not necessarily thrilled with them. Now, of course, for some of you, the compact size, the less expensive price, the inclusion of optical image stabilization, and just the general pairing with the camera body you have, this may be the better choice for you. And if it is, then enjoy the lens. It really is a cut above standard other kit lenses. But whereas I would look at this competing with the typical 18 to 55 millimeter kit lens, I look at the 16 to 55 millimeter as, more like competing with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens on a full frame system. And while it's, maybe not in every way comparable of that, I think that it's very close to many of such lenses that I have reviewed. And so I just think that maybe it's competing at a different level. Of course, its size and its price is not for everyone. And so if you want a general purpose lens for travel or just general purpose shooting and you don't want to be changing lenses, you don't want to mess with primes, then the 18 to 55 millimeter is a great option. If you look in the description down below, you can find an image gallery. You can take a little bit more look at some of the photos. We looked at a few as a part of this review, but there's a lot more of them there, and so you can take a look at that. There's also buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and there's also the standard linkage to follow me on social media, sign up for my newsletter, and stay abreast of everything that's happening. You can also sign up to become a patron and help to support what I'm doing directly, and as a reward, I give my patrons advanced screenings of upcoming content a week in advance and a chance to interact with me before anyone else does on that content. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.